All right, welcome everybody. We're delighted to host Michelle Anya Anjirbag as the author of Appropriated Tales, which is the reason for this talk today. It came out last year. Michelle's research interests include adaptation, fairy tales and folklore, Disney, magical libraries, which I'm excited about too, the intersection of literature, media and culture, representations of gender and age, and cross-period approaches to narrative transmission across cultures and societies. Our director would normally host, but he's not able to come to this one. So yeah, thanks so much for being here, Michelle, and I'll leave it to you to start your presentation.
All right, thank you so much for the introduction, and I'm just going to share some slides, and hopefully everyone can see that now. But all right, so hello everyone, and thank you so much for joining me today to hear about my new book. And many thanks to Heather Robbins for that introduction and for the Chichester Center for Fairy Tale, Fantasy, and Speculative Fiction for the invitation to speak with you all about my first academic monograph, Appropriated Tales, Race in the Disney Fairy Tale Mode. So, as you heard a few of my interests, I am a scholar who works on questions of power and representation in children's literature and media, and fantasy, broadly using cultural studies lenses. Because my subjects of choice are largely found in popular culture and children's or youth culture, I often tell people that my job is to ruin everything. And of course, what I mean by this is that I often try to encourage people to reach past their nostalgia, to look closely at the media and narratives that feel formative to how they have shaped their worldviews. Appropriated Tales is work that I developed out of my doctoral research, which examined how racialized and ethnic diversity was constructed in the fairy tale and folklorist films of the Disney Corporation from 1989 onwards. I cover a period I define as from Mermaid to Mermaid, so from the 1989 animated film that sparked a resurgence of the corporation to its live-action remake starring Halle Bailey in 2023, to better understand how Disney's storytelling practices can demonstrate wider cultural patterns of racialized and ethnic representation in family media. Through this examination, I try to unpack the real-world impacts on people and cultures that the studio has historically misrepresented, effaced, or even erased. I was drawn to this topic for several reasons. First, I was an avid reader of fairy tales and fantasy growing up in the 90s in the United States, and the Disney versions were really formative to that interest developing. I watched the films, but my family had also been given some of the hardback books that had been made novelizing the Disney classics. Viewing became inherently tied to textuality, and so these narratives experienced across multiple forms of media became a literary doorway, one that fostered an interest in fairy tale adaptation and adaptation in general, even before I had language to name the interest. I was also interested in ideas of who belonged, what kinds of stories were told, and from what different angles and experiences. Through my higher education career, I moved through different academic interests across the fields of not only literature, but also anthropology and sociology, as well as jobs in both publishing and in journalism. As I moved through these roles in these fields of study, I became more fascinated by the idea of who is allowed to tell stories, to decide what stories are important for people to interact with, to be able to publish or produce stories for mass audiences, and within all those questions, ultimately, what becomes considered universal stories versus what is sold as or deliberately marketed as for a niche audience. During my graduate and doctoral research, these ideas became refined into questions about globalization, corporate power, and adaptation, while also looking at who is allowed to occupy media spaces, especially fairy tale, folkloresque, and fantasy spaces, where ostensibly anything is possible. Narrative is not experienced from a distance, but something that through the telling and receiving of story, we become immersed within. The closeness of imagination and fiction constantly felt like something that had to be named and framed and considered to really be able to construct a study that would join the questions I was starting to articulate with a lifetime of observation of media. When I was first starting the research that became this book as a doctoral student, I realized that everything I had previously learned about the importance of distance, rationality, or the implicit empiricism of academic research could no longer apply in the way I had been told they would. While often touted as ironclad rules, well, these things do not let you see the full picture of what you are questioning or examining, especially when you are very much a part of the landscape you are trying to paint. So while I'm here to talk about my book, I'm also here to talk to you about orienting yourself within your research practice and using that to then let yourself grow, expand, stretch, and also to bring your whole self with you into the work. Orient is a word with many meanings, both denotations and connotations, and it became a byword of my research as I refined it into the book you might pick up today. Edward Said, of course, gives us the term Orientalism to describe the so-called West's depictions of and attitude toward the so-called East or Orient. Sarah Ahmed writes in Queer Phenomenology that the starting point for orientation is the point from which the world unfolds, the here of the body and the where of its dwelling, asking questions about what it means to be oriented, to locate where we are in spaces, and then make our ways through them. As a verb, to orient is to align or position, or more conceptually, to tailor or adapt something, to position in relation to. And orienteering is a practice of navigating through spaces known or unknown, using presumed to be known factors such as stars, geography, and topology. Perhaps you might have noticed that parallels in these different ways of considering orientation. All of these ways of thinking through this concept have something to do, in some ways, with space. From where we are to how we fill it, to how we occupy it. The more time I spend thinking about large esoteric concepts about what it means to be human in relation to some of the most mundane seeming things in the world, such as literature, film, and television shows, the more I realize that self-knowledge, the orientation of the self in its understanding of the world, is the core of inquiry. Because it is in understanding how we take up space, how we occupy and move through the world, through our communities, through our surroundings, both familiar and unfamiliar, that we understand what there is to be questioned, examined, pulled apart, and remade. In other words, to be adapted. I could not find my deeper research questions until I had grappled with the question of where I fit, until I navigated all the ways in which moving to a new geographic location and how I was framed by others in it unsettled my ontological position. But reorienting how I understood myself in relation to the work let me find these questions and start digging for answers. Not all of my work deals with ethnic and racialized representations, or even representation more widely, but all of my work is concerned with the idea of power, who expresses it, who exerts it, who has power enacted against them, and what does it mean to be powerful or not? How is power shaped, understood, and then how are those understandings reiterated to future generations through a consensus reality we construct and enact on a daily basis through interaction with and consumption of imaginary spaces? And of course, it is one thing to tell someone to do this, to put their whole self into the work or into learning, and it is quite another to show you how you might start to do this through my own process for making this book. So I started this research from a completely different project. I started proposing doctoral research in 2016. I had a journalism background as well as a decade under my belt of working with people as a leadership facilitator and mediator, which sometimes meant high adventure ropes courses and mostly meant making people learn to communicate well under pressure. I was also chronically online in these roles, frustrated by the state of the world on a global scale. Thank you. So frustrated by the state of the world on a global scale, and also how those events that were happening globally were also playing out locally. Because of the kind of work I did, I zeroed in on a project on masculinities in popular fantasy franchises, and how there was a legacy of popular culture that was couching quite conservative beliefs in lowbrow, mass-consumed media spaces. Essentially, I was considering series like Twilight and The Immortal Instruments, and starting to pick apart how a subset of religious beliefs were being coded into YA fantasy along rigid gender lines, starting to question what underlined the tropes, so to speak, that were becoming a part of this genre in a way that felt like nothing else was publishing if it didn't follow a particular set of norms. While this was the pitch that opened the door to further study, my plans changed early in the doctoral process. Once I joined the faculty at Cambridge, David Whitley at one point remarked that I was seeing so much of the big picture that he could not find me in the proposal. And what he meant by that is that he couldn't understand my why, my answer to the question, how will your research save the world? Which was a favorite interview question of one of the Children's Literature Center scholars. This led me to making a very complicated mind map, where I sat down and traced through a ton of books and series that had caught my attention over time, and I started trying to pattern spot through this big web of texts and the narratives buried inside them. I ended up taking this big printed out mess to him, unfolded it all over his desk, and it felt like sharing the inside of my brain with someone. All this stuff that had started clumping together as a child reader that I never thought was anything more than my weird fascination with literature that no one else I knew was really interested in. While we were looking at it together, he focused on the Disney corner, he circled it, and he asked why what I was tracing there had never come up. All I could say was that these films were part of my formative entrance into fairy tales, but that surely no one would let me structure graduate work around them, especially not at the University of Cambridge, and the rest, as they say, is, well, literary history. With critical goggles on, the cracks began to appear in what I call in this book the Disney fairy tale mode. I re-examined which characters I felt connected to, why, how others might have placed me in narrative spaces I might not have chosen for myself. Autoethnographic returns to childhood viewing, all while the company kept reiterating its own products and remaking its own history in a way, let me once again take that zoomed out look at a whole. But this time, I understood how and where I was constructing my analysis from. And if you will indulge me, I would like to share a short reading from the book itself to demonstrate what that process of orientation and reorientation brought to the work, the foundation in which I found myself standing to write it, and the work that will follow on from it. This is a passage from the introduction in a section where I'm positioning Disney within US-centric culture and in relation to its reflection of hegemonic cultural norms. I mentioned that Disney was a formative cultural touchstone for me as a third culture kid, but there is another context that also needs addressing in terms of answering the question of why I focus my lens on Disney as a corporation in particular. Racialized dehumanization and segregation is an ongoing historical narrative that underpins the foundation of the United States. The media we consume at large plays no small part in reinforcing these narratives, either overtly or covertly, and further, broadcasts them in international contexts. I am acutely aware that, as the child of people who were able to immigrate from India to the United States in the 1980s, and who was then able to receive a powerful foundational public education, attend a public university, and go on to pursue graduate studies internationally in the heart of one of the largest colonial empires. The opportunities I have had in life have been shaped by extractive and settler colonialism. But these opportunities have also been shaped by civil rights movements that then resulted in doors being opened to my parents, and so to me. I need to straightforwardly acknowledge that as a non-Black, non-Indigenous woman of color with global mobility, the opportunities that I have been offered have come at a cost that I have not had to pay. I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that had the civil rights movement of the 1960s in the United States not resulted in the abolishment of the national origins formula through the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, imperfect as it was, which opened the door to more people immigrating to the United States, my life, my story, could have been a very different one. The fact that my parents could immigrate to the United States in the 1980s from India is due in particular to the efforts of Black activists during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. In an effort to solidify the United States as a white nation, the early 20th century saw Congress pass the Immigration Act of 1917 and the Immigration Act of 1924, which is also known as the Asian Exclusion Act. The 1917 Act saw the banning of Asian, Mexican, and Mediterranean people, as well as people who were poor, political radicals, or people with disabilities. The 1924 Act created the quota system, prioritizing those from Northern and Western Europe and restricting immigration from Eastern Europe and Africa, before outright banning Arabs, Asians, and Indians. These laws were only repealed after the Civil Rights Movement, when following the passing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 was also passed. This act ended the quota system and, among other things, ended the discriminatory practices established in the 1917 and 1924 Acts. Without the changes wrought by the Civil Rights Movement, my family would not have been able to build good lives of opportunity in the United States, and I am well aware that without those things, I would probably not be sitting speaking with you all here today. And yet the same opportunities, the same rights to life and potentials are still withheld systemically from those who did the work to let me have the life that I had and have within an ultimately unjust system. The privileges of a quiet, opportunity-filled life in the suburbs, access to the ability to go to a good public institution, to earn a master's degree overseas, to return again to another country for a PhD and be allowed to stay there and continue working and engaging in other opportunities offered to me, have everything to do with how I am and am not racialized in both US and UK society. Model minority myths are toxic, but I also cannot ignore the way that the perception of my body has aided me and opened certain doors, even as other things might have made my life harder. My right to not only seize opportunities, but even just to live my life has been realized, even as the same right is systemically denied to far too many. It is not lost on me that I finished my doctoral work amid the backdrop of a pandemic and of global protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police officers on 25 May 2020. That I have completed my higher education in parallel with the Black Lives Matter movement's existence, and that my ability to have ever approached this work in the first place began with the work of the Civil Rights Movement's quests for true liberation of all within the United States, a cause still fought for, and not only in that country. This is an action that is rooted more than a full generation before my own, but the impact remains. In light of this, for me, it becomes more important to consider the long-term effects of the stories we do or do not tell or demand to be told as a society. My opportunities are indebted to the work of those who came before me. The least I can do as a scholar is to encourage others to look at the world they think they know in different ways, to find the structural seeds of injustice in the places they might not think to look. So why Disney? Why now? Because in some ways we have become too comfortable with the narratives we are being fed. And in other ways, we need to remember how to look for what and who is missing, so that we can ask better questions about the worlds we are told to imagine and who belongs in them intrinsically. Who fits in the worlds that we are led to imagine wonder and impossibility unfold in is a large part of what Disney participates in shaping, intentionally or unintentionally. And I thank you for your indulgence, and I hope that what we can all see from that passage is that, for me at least, orienting oneself and one's research within a larger historical and cultural context and movement is something that can ground us within the knowledge we are seeking. In Appropriated Tales, I look specifically at how racialized and ethnic diversity is made visible using Disney as a case study. I chose this corporation because of not only its nostalgic legacy in my own life, but also because of its global market share. As we can see from this graphic that describes the corporation's holdings as of 2019, the corporation's reach is extensive, covering not just the film, television, and parks that might first come to mind, but also the publishing industry, music, hospitality, educational projects, and real estate. But the power on the globalized stage is primarily solidified through the perception of and reception of its media products. I ask how the corporation has managed to convince so many people all over the world to accept their prominence and to literally buy into the version of fantasy that the corporation sells. My argument through the book is thematically organized rather than making a historicizing argument or a periodizing argument. Part of the reason I do this is so that I can take a cross-period approach to patterns in aesthetic decisions, animation techniques, narrative choices, and patterns in representation. A cross-period approach considers not just how that past influences what comes afterwards, but also how newer media can inform or provide new ways to think about what has come before it. When this is combined with approaches such as Sarah Ahmed's formulation of orientation and Anamik Saha's cultural industries approach, it allows us to ask questions about where does a corporation stand when it shapes the other? And how is that depiction then received by those who are supposed to see themselves in such depictions, whether they were included in the creation of the media or not? I then use the insights from such analyses to think about how Disney has reshaped our idea of how fairy tales work as narratives, how they create meaning, who belongs in them, and who they are ultimately for. The introduction explains the scope, methods, and why I did this. The structural patterns and narrative confines adhered to by the corporation are something I discuss as the Disney fairy tale mode in Chapter 1, where I also explore how Disney's core fairy tale aesthetic was reset during the Disney Renaissance to court a more multicultural and global audience. In Chapter 2, I examine how Blackness has been specifically excluded or sidestepped in Disney productions since 1989, a continued legacy of erasure that adds to the perception of the corporation's narratives as white space. In Chapter 3, I show how Blackness has been othered within the corporation by exploring the limitations placed on possibilities for Black princess characters compared to their white counterparts, and by pointing to examples of both more authentic and more inauthentic representation since 1989. If there is a particular time and space, or a particular chronotope, to use Mikhail Bakhtin's terminology, that is shaped by Disney's fairy tale mode, then Chapter 4 looks at how Disney marks narratives that fall outside its core aesthetic as different in terms of where and in what time period they are set. In Chapter 5, I explore the pattern of remakes and reconfigurations of Disney's classic narratives, many of which include the films that were produced during the Disney Renaissance or shortly afterward, as well as the different directions the films have taken in more recent years. And finally, I conclude by thinking about where the corporation could go next in the future. And of course, this is already feeling woefully out of date in some ways. So, the joys of writing about something very contemporary and happening now. While I learned a lot about Disney productions in particular, enough for a second book in fact, there were a few larger realizations for me that had an impact on both my why to keep down this research path and the approaches I continued to use in projects that came afterwards. First, while I was refining my doctoral research into this book, I did have to grapple with the fact that while I was constantly naming types of diversity, I was never naming what that diversity was in relation to. This started me down the path of thinking about the idea of what becomes canonical, how norms are reiterated, and what it means to create a cohesive aesthetic and narrative form, whether on a corporate or a national or a cultural level. Those thoughts are being refined right now into a manuscript that will hopefully be coming out soon with Edinburgh University Press. When it comes to method, I really saw the benefit of a large but defined corpus selection. By choosing the corpus such that there was similarity and overlap, but also anomalies in the materials considered, I could ask a wider variety of questions through different pairings and groupings because I had enough material to generate unconventional patterns. This let me also think about wider processes of categorization and grouping on a metacritical level, and how categorization is as much a process of exclusion as it is inclusion. Not only does this affect this book structure and that of the companion book, but it has helped me in completely different research projects, such as during a postdoctoral fellowship on the Constructing Age for Young Readers project, where my focus was on depictions of older women, and in particular witches, across another large but clearly defined corpus. This illustrates in a way that research and critical examination is as much about methods and processes as it is about the analysis of specific texts or specific media. And one of the biggest things that I learned from this, a first book project based on work that had in one way been declared already finished, is that research is not so much about finding definitive answers, but rather accruing knowledge to ask more questions from more angles. So to briefly illustrate how looking across decades can reveal similarities that bear paying attention to, I want to look at some of the parallels I found when analyzing the films Mulan and Moana, using the lenses of Orientalism and coloniality. Once again, Orientalism is a term that Edward Said coined to describe the West's depictions of and attitudes towards the East or Orient. And coloniality refers to the conceptual and ideological matrix of power that came to be in the Atlantic world in the 16th century and unified imperialism and capitalism. Essentially, it is an understanding of colonialism as girding capitalism and modernity, where the subjugation of the other became both an ideological and an economic necessity. Now, while I do not delve into the connections between folklore and the creation or projection of national identities, I think it is important to talk about the power dynamics involved when a company such as Disney decides to tell stories and sell stories from outside of its own cultural purview. We can comfortably define Disney's spaces as rooted in Anglophone, Western, and specifically the hegemonic culture of the United States, despite its success as branding itself as a creator of and site for global narratives. It is a company that wields global power through one-directional narrative transmission rather than exchange. Coloniality also cannot be discussed without an understanding that the legacy of colonialism remains embedded in global social, cultural, and economic institutions and practices. As Claire Bradford problematizes in terms of indigeneity and indigenous representations, Western cultures tend to learn about the culture that they define as the other through representations of the other created from an outsider's viewpoint or through orientalized depictions of the other. So when a global corporation such as Disney centers a Western orientalizing view of another culture, be it ancient China or Polynesia, and then projects that depictions outwards to a globalized entertainment market, it participates in and perpetuates that system of coloniality. And in doing so, it perpetuates that process of cultural dominance and erasure, while also setting its version up as an authoritative and authentic version of these narratives. So now that we understand the power dynamics, let's consider the parallels. While Mulan was released in 1998 and Moana premiered 18 years later in 2016, they're both significant as films that strove to break the princess stereotype, that had single-named heroines as their title, and both are films that purported to be Disney firsts, a first foray into Asia and a first attempt at depicting Polynesia and Oceania, both according to corporate paratexts, done with cultural authenticity in mind. Both films were high up the list for live-action remediations as well. The live-action Mulan released in 2020, and Moana is allegedly forthcoming in the next year. It becomes interesting, too, that in both cases, Disney shifts from a proto-medievalist time period for its setting, as is the case in its European fairy tale-derived films, to an ancient time period. Both films aesthetically make choices to visually and musically try to create a sense of authenticity as well, particularly through the opening sequences and then a musical number where a more traditional art or illustration style is incorporated into the wider textual fabric of the film. In Mulan, this happens in the song A Girl Worth Fighting For, where you have the illustrations of the different soldiers' perfect women. And in Moana, this happens during the song You're Welcome, where the Maui that is tattooed on Maui's body enacts the different myths and legends that he is credited with. One other parallel, both had in-community criticisms levied at them that called into question the corporation's claims to authentic representation. And these parallels are interesting to consider as a potential formula for how to take the other and to make it Disney, because these are similar choices that were made almost 2 decades apart in terms of how to signal both authenticity and authority. And it is actually that pull between authenticity and authority that makes it more possible to see how and where Disney's overall methods of incorporation do not hold up under scrutiny. In essence, the more details that are provided to create a veneer or an assertion of truth or accuracy in representation, the more there is, as I show in the book, to question. This is not something that is only true with these 2 films. For example, the paratext surrounding the live-action Aladdin film including news reports of actors in brownface, with simultaneous interviews with designers crowing about the accuracy of aesthetic details used to cement the world building, is simply another instance of Disney's cultural ventriloquism, to borrow a phrase from Marjorie Garber, rather than seizing an opportunity to fund and promote productive, balanced intercultural partnerships. Ultimately, through my exploration of the corporation's outputs from mermaid to mermaid, I hope to do several things. The first is to model how cross-period investigations of a corporation's outputs might be fruitful ground for deeper considerations of the relationships between narrative transmission and hegemonic norms. There is, after all, much I do not have room to investigate. While my focus is on racialization and ethnic representation, hegemony can be deconstructed in a variety of ways, including gender, sexuality, class, and disability, just to name a few. Another thing that I hope to do is to demonstrate how multiple and recursive adaptations and patterns of adaptation can tell us things about dominant cultural ideas and encourage us to look not just at individual cases for analysis, which are important, but to also start looking at larger pictures and how these are not closed systems, but rather exist in relation to larger systems and cultural patterns and norms. And the last thing that I will mention for now is that I hope to demonstrate that nostalgia and critical analysis do not have to be mutually exclusive categories. I think that especially as scholars, it is doubly important to turn a critical eye towards our favorites, or those things that we once had and even might still have a strong affinity for, to constantly re-examine how we position ourselves in relation to those narratives, and thereby in relation to the cultural traditions and heritage they represent and reiterate. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to any questions you might have for me.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That was really interesting. Does anyone have any questions? I might have missed, you might have already explained this, I'm sorry. I was a round of applause coming through on the
Thank you.
on the emojis.
Mhm.
The 1989 date, why is that significant for the representation of Blackness?
So in 1989, the corporation releases The Little Mermaid, and this is considered sort of the rebirth of the corporation. It's also one of the first times you see a non-minstrel Black figure in these animations by the corporation. So we might all remember Sebastian the Crab and how he has a very particular accent. And that Caribbean accent becomes a more positive representation, especially when we're comparing to things like the crows in Dumbo, or there are centaurs in Fantasia that they have carefully edited out. There's a lot of different racialized representations in the historical animation. Another example is the roustabouts at the beginning of the animated Dumbo film. So these faceless limbs and heads that are darkly colored in setting up the circus, for example. All of these things kind of see a significant, even if not enough of a shift when we hit 1989. And this also coincides with Disney starting to expand as a global corporation. It is in the 1990s that we get Euro Disney. It is later in the 90s that we see the park starting to emerge in China. And if you're interested in how the parks kind of travel around the world and these castles sort of pop up around the world representing Disney, Sabrina Mittermeier has an incredible book on the Disney theme parks, which I strongly recommend for that. But yeah, so yeah, the Disney Renaissance 1989 is really, really becoming this kind of point, this break point in the corporation's history, although other scholars are also challenging this as a definitive break point. Peter Kunze, for example, has an amazing book on Disney and the connections between the corporation and Broadway. It came out, I think, just a year before mine, but he talks about how that 1989 thing, actually, we should be shifting that periodization a few years earlier based on when the production actually starts versus the release. So yeah, it's become an easy touchstone, but it's when I also kind of unpick how and why we're using that, and I'm using it as a shorthand, but it's definitely something that requires more thinking about as well.
Oh, there's always more nuance.
Exactly.
Lydia asked in the chat, can you talk a bit about The Princess and the Frog in New Orleans from 2006?
I think it came out 2009.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't know, Lydia, if you want to ask a more specific question about that, because I mean, I do dedicate the better part of a chapter to it, so there is a lot to say. But in terms of just as an animated film, it is significant for two reasons per the corporation. And the first is that it was the first Black animated princess character that they produced. So corporation starts making films in the 1930s. We don't have this till 2009, um, which is significant. And then the other thing was that in terms of the corporation's own historicizing, it was a marked return to hand-drawn cell animation. So in the 2000s, we have a very different kind of computer-generated inflicted animation process that was being used. If we can think about films such as Treasure Planet or Atlantis, they have a very different aesthetic feel to them. Princess and the Frog was a return to this early kind of nostalgic, classic, so-called classic Disney animation style. It's a beautifully done film in a lot of ways, and I think there are people who have done incredible work on it. But when we step back and take a look at it, I think there are also significant things that we need to problematize about it. We have our first Black princess, but she is most of the time a green frog on screen, for example. We have a first Black princess who's very much limited by the historical context of kind of the post-slavery period in the South. Like she and her family very much live out of town. Her mom is a domestic worker. When she wants to open her own restaurant, despite the fact that she has the money for the building, there are both gender and racialized undertones to how she is refused access to the building that she wants to make a restaurant in. When the two bankers say, somebody like you, we know as a knowledgeable audience that that means it's both that she's a woman and that she's a Black woman who thinks that she is going to open up her own business in New Orleans in this time period. So there is quite a lot to be said about how culture and how the aesthetic of that film is produced. You know, it's one of those things that if this existed, but we also had other versions of Black bodies taking up purely fairy tale princess spaces, we might be having a different conversation. But because she is the singular one as of right now, yeah, it's a bit complicated. I think it's also very positive that, you know, there is something for small children to look at and say, this looks like me on screen. So I think it's really important when we're unpicking something that is so vast, such as Disney. It's not about, is this ultimately good or bad? Though, of course, they have done some very, very bad things, which we will call bad. But understanding that these are all being produced on a wide scale of human experience, if that makes sense.
Yes.
I don't know how much that was an answer or a non-answer in relation to that very
Thank you,
wide
thank you.
topic.
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense.
Yeah.
That makes complete sense. And I was also wondering, how do the Disney decide which fairy tale to transport where? You know, how do they map the
I think so. I don't do archival research. I work on the stuff that's outside of that. So there are other scholars that kind of look more at kind of the production context. Like Peter Kunze, I think, is one person you could really kind of turn to his work to look at that. I'm of course blanking on everybody else's names right now, but it's, I think, important to note that while there are some decisions that are made in very heavy top-down ways in the corporation, and that is a bit of a legacy of when Walt Disney was running it himself, ultimately film production is a team product. There are team efforts. There might be somebody ultimately saying yes or no, but it is very much a group of people working together. There is never as much of a single vision as, you know, we kind of think of it as just Disney's voice. There are hundreds of people who work on these films and who shape what is coming. And these things are always, always, always in flux. So the who and the how is a bit more complicated than I can get into.
Thank you.
Yes.
Got two more questions in the chat on the same theme. So Alice says, The film's representation of voodoo was not well received. People felt that a sacred religion had been misrepresented. Do you think that in Moana, the representation of religion was more positively received by the communities concerned? And then, sorry, just to do the other one in that chat is, did the corporation choose the time period of The Princess and the Frog to criticize or emphasize the racial underpinnings? Sorry, those questions are related.
No, so I mean, I'll start with the second one first. I mean, like, I think it's really difficult to say, like, did they choose something to criticize or emphasize? Because again, there are so many people working on this, and different people will make different decisions based on different things. Do I think that the film actually, and how it was produced and what we watch, criticizes the racialized nature of that time period? No, I do not. I think it very much takes it as just a historicizing moment, and it's a backdrop, and it's this play towards historical accuracy and detail that we see in a lot of the Disney films in different ways. So when we get historical details in terms of costuming and in terms of building and the different aesthetic designs in the live action films, we're seeing the same pattern of, if we are accurate and truthful, we're kind of playing into this hole between realism and believability. I wouldn't call The Princess and the Frog critical of that time period in any way. Nor do I think it would be Disney's place to, in a fairy tale film, be making those criticisms. I am not sure how that would work well, or be received well, or in a way that is globally parsable. When it comes to Moana, I think that there was a good volume of cultural criticism of how different parts of the culture were perceived and remade. One of the most significant criticisms that came out of cultural corners was that in Polynesian legendary and mythic traditions, you don't have single gods or goddesses. These figures are usually in a binary representation, a gendered binary representation. So Maui has a counterpart, Hina. If you look at different Polynesian and Samoan and Maori legends where Maui appears in this part of this world, there he is a counterpart, and that counterpart has been erased. There is and was also playing fast and loose with traditional customs. So one of the things that I mentioned in the book is that somebody okayed for children's Halloween costume something that was essentially a skin suit with Maui tattoos. If we know anything about the colonial impact of the West, let's say widely, but particularly British colonialism in that area of the world, we know that there are even museums today, both in the UK and the US, that have skin, that where bodies were skinned for their tattoos as artifacts. So the production of something like a skin suit, very, very inappropriate. It did get pulled, but the fact that somebody did not know about that context, even though if you watch Moana and you watch it all the way through the credits, they have the Oceanic Story Trust credited at the end of the film. So there's this appearance of, we've done everything in partnership, but what does that partnership actually entail? It is very, very hard to say from the outside. And it's part of the story the corporation tells about how they're making their story. Those paratexts become very, very important to how they're representing what they're calling diversity.
Inez had their hand up.
Yes.
And then you put in the chat, is it okay to turn your mic on? It definitely is. Inez, do you want to ask your question out loud?
Hello, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I lost a bit of the beginning of the talk because I got the time zones wrong. I'm sorry.
That's all right.
But so my question is not as much about race, but because I'm also doing my PhD on Disney and on old women. So I'm more focused on aging and gender. And I'm going to look especially at the Owl House, which is also Disney, but more, but it's Disney Channel. So I was wondering if you had any comment or any advice on looking at these kinds of works that are not so mainstream, but also clearly have the influence of the Disney Corporation behind them and the impact that can have on a lot of things.
I don't usually worry about whether or not what I'm writing about is mainstream. And I think there's a very, like, I mean, yes, this book is very much on Disney's feature animated films, but I have plenty of other work where I'm writing about very niche shows or fantasy books and series that will have their own particular audiences. I think the biggest thing is to figure out how to explain why you think this particular work is the best example you have to talk about the phenomenon you want to talk about in analyzing media, if that makes sense.
Yes, that makes total sense. Thank you. And so, just to clarify, the book you were introducing, it is like the published version of your thesis,
It
correct?
is half of my thesis. It
Okay.
is the whole dissertation was broken up into two parts. So this one very much focuses on where they were trying to, or saying they were trying to engage in more diverse representation on racialization and in terms of ethnic representation. I'm currently in process of finishing the manuscript for the second book, which will look more at the construction of canon and how Disney uses ideas of canon and cultural authority to cement their sense of normal and what that tells us about asking questions about things like cultural hegemony and whiteness as a default norm to which we compare all other representation.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
And then in the chat, S asks about the movie Sinners.
I
using
have
the
unfortunately not seen that yet. I did see that question come in. It is on my list when I am no longer buried in a manuscript. I'm hoping to catch up with that over the summer, but I have heard incredible things about it. So I'm sorry I can't speak more about that.
No problem. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, S is right. When you get there, enjoy.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah, I've heard very, very good things, so I'm very excited.
So we might have come to the end of the questions if anyone else has any. If not, then we shall thank Michelle.
Thank you so
This
much
was
for having me.
really interesting. I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Really appreciate it.
And I'm going to pester your publishers to maybe try and get a discount code for the attendees. We'll see if I can get it though. Because
Fingers
but then,
crossed.
if the-
I'm sure they'll play ball, I'm sure. But
Those of us that
yeah,
haven't
I
read it.
unfortunately don't have one, but
No, no.
yeah.
So I'll send that around with the recording later, hopefully. And yeah, thank you so much, Michelle. It was amazing.
I really
Good.
appreciate everyone coming on a Tuesday. Well, evening for me, but whatever time zone you are in, thank you for your attendance.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.